Welcome to Johnstown Christian Weekly Message with Teaching Pastor Tony Shaver. We invite you to join us at 10 o'clock every Sunday morning. Thank you for listening to this week's message. How many of you would say that you are rich? Well, let me ask another one. How wealthy do you feel? Now, if you're like most people, you will probably give a different answer to those questions. For one thing, rich is a relative term. Compared to Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, most of us are not rich. But compared to the rest of the world, if you live in the United States or make more than $10,000 a year, then you make more than 84% of the people of the world. What I am saying is, as a nation, we're a wealthy people. And even though we don't feel rich and we look at the price of food and the utilities and gas and where it keeps going up and up and up, inflation keeps going up and up and up, interest rates keep going up and up and up, and it feels like everything else is going down, down, down in our bank account. But if we had got a roof over our head, food in our pantry, and clean water to drink, then we're doing better than millions of people around the world. So the question is not, do you have wealth? The question I want to pose to you today, and what James is going to talk about, is, does wealth have you? We're in a series called Faith That Works, where we're looking at the book of James and the practical teachings of, he writes to scattered Jewish Christians, but we can glean a lot from this letter. And one of the things that he talks about, especially in chapter 5, is wealth or money. The Bible has a lot to say about money and wealth. And no, this is not a tithing sermon. The Bible does, though, the majority of the stories that Jesus talked about. In fact, some say that Jesus talked more about money than he talked about heaven or hell. Because the majority of the stories or the verses that are attached when it talks about money or wealth, excuse me, there's a warning involved. There's a warning attached. So the question becomes, is money evil? Is wealth evil? Is having wealth wrong? No. The answer to that is no. This is not a sermon to make you feel guilty about having wealth. Because money has no moral value. It's neither good or evil. It's the attitude and actions toward wealth that determines whether it is good or evil. 1 Timothy 6:10 says this. We've heard this a lot, but a lot of times people miss one word. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Love being the word that is sometimes omitted. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people, craving money, have wandered from the true faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. So this is what James is going to address. The warnings of wealth. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. These next verses that we're going to tackle sounds like an Old Testament prophet. He's not going to spare any punches. And you're not going to find these verses on coffee mugs. Let's start looking at it. James 5, starting in verse 1. Look here, you rich people. Weep and moan with anguish because of all the terrible troubles ahead of you. What? Your wealth is rotting away, and your fine clothes are moth-eating rags. Your gold and silver are corroded. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. Aren't you glad you came to church? This corroded treasure you have hoarded will testify against you on the day of judgment. Let's open this up and kind of unpack this a little bit. James is going to give some warnings. Here's the first warning in these verses. You can write this down. Warning number 1. Wealth can make us deceived and arrogant. Wealth can make us deceived and arrogant. You see, this is one of the deceptions of the devil in the mindset of the world, culture. It claims that being rich is the essence of happiness, security, and fulfillment. That's the illusion that's being taught. And James is saying, Christian, he's not writing to the world, he's writing to believers. Christian, this has corroded you. You have been deceived. You see, in the first century, there were 3 main indicators of wealth. That you had land where you can grow crops. 2, if you had nice clothes or you sold types of fabric and garments. 3, if you had or saved gold and silver. Some things have changed, but a lot haven't. So this is what he says. Hey guys, listen. Your crops have rotted. Your clothes are moth. They got holes in them. They're ruined. Your gold and silver, they're corroded. The value has gone down. What is he saying? You've been deceived thinking that your security, your importance is tied up in all of this stuff, and you become arrogant with it when it has all become less of value. Your wealth has deceived you and made you arrogant, and you think that you're secure, better off than those people because you have wealth. So James is warning them, don't be deceived. Things can happen, and the wealth can and will vanish. He's warning them, don't be arrogant. One day, those people might be you. And on top of that, when Judgment Day comes, God's going to ask you, what did you do with the wealth that I blessed you with? Because did you see what he said? The corroded treasure you have hoarded will what? testify against you on the day of judgment. Now here's the truth. Money allows you to have stuff. Nice stuff. You can buy things. You can buy influence. It opens the door for opportunity, for education. Money talks. But here's the problem. Money, one of its favorite words is goodbye. And here's the truth. Unless Jesus comes back, we're all going to die. That's the truth of the matter. And we cannot take our wealth with us. I saw a bumper sticker that said, "He who dies with the most toy wins." That is so stupid. Here's why it's stupid. You end up dead. And your toys are either given to the government or someone else. There's an Italian proverb that says, "The last robe you wear has no pockets." That's why Jesus says in Matthew 6, verse 19, "Don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them, and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures up in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy, and the thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is," say this, church, "there the desires of your heart will also be." First warning he gives. Wealth can make us deceived and arrogant. The next warning that James gives, you can write this down. Warning number 2. Wealth can make us cruel and greedy. Remember, it's an action and attitude. Because greed is the breeding ground of discontentment and entitlement. And the result of it? Selfishness and mistreatment to others. James chapter 5, verse 4. "For listen, hear the cries of the field workers whom you have cheated of their pay." He's talking to Christians now. "The cries of those who harvest your fields have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies." Now James gives an example they dealt with. And it still exists today. See, in the first century, many farmers had land and didn't have the equipment that we have today to take care of those fields. So they would hire day laborers, and we might call more migrant workers. They were hired by the landowner or the farmer to come work the fields, and they were paid by the day. And those men worked from sunrise to sundown, depending on the owner to keep his word, to pay them an honest wage for an honest day's work. Obviously, because James has brought this up to the Christian community, some wealthy Christian landowners, because of their greed, were cheating the workers for the work they had done for them. So the worker would go home with very little to show for his hard work. He's angry and worried because he's desperate to take care of his wife and his children and his family. But what could he do? He couldn't afford a lawyer. He couldn't file a complaint because then once he filed a complaint, word would get out that that person's a troublemaker and he would get no work whatsoever. The system was really rigged against them. And this happens all the time. It looks a little different, but it still goes on. Employer cheating the employee. All because of greed. And James issues a stern warning. God hears the cries of the oppressed who call out to him day and night. So here's the message in one sentence, this warning. The person who cheats their employees will be dealt with by God. And believe you me, he's big enough to do something about it. Many people think they can get away with it. But the Lord, he said, the Lord of heaven's army heard the cries. And he can do something about it. Wealth can protect you from many things here on earth, but it cannot protect you against the Creator and Sustainer of all things. Warning number 2, wealth can make us cruel and greedy. Here's the third one. Write this down. Warning number 3, wealth can make us self-indulgent. We know this to be true. Look at verse 5. You have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You have fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. Now, we would have read that a little different. We would have written, you have fattened yourself to take it easy in retirement. But that's not what that said. So what is James saying? He's basically rebuking them for their selfishness and greed. And I believe, let me just pause here and say, one of the things that I love about this church is that we're very generous. So this might not completely apply to us, but it is good to heed the warning. Because I believe the devil uses wealth to trick us into thinking that we don't need God. Think about it. Think about your prayer life. When everything's good, when everything seems to be going well, everything seems to be just motoring along, let's be honest. Does your prayer life seem to become less intense than when the storms of life are hitting, when the tragedies are hitting, when things are happening to your loved ones, when things are going where you don't understand why things are happening and you don't see the end result? Then that's where it seems where you just, there's a country song that says about prayer. God, I need a favor. I know I don't deserve it, but God, I need a favor. And somehow wealth does that. The attitude and actions of our lives when we get a lot of wealth, one of the hardest group of people that has been proven to be evangelized are those who are wealthy and comfortable. After all, if you've got money, you can create your own heaven on earth. But the attitude with wealth is, the more money you have, the more money you want. Am I right? Well, Solomon would agree. Look at Ecclesiastes 5:10. Those who love money will never have enough. How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness. One of the best examples that Courtney and I were talking about this just yesterday. One of the great illustrations, I think, is some of the NFL players, where they get these fat contracts to play ball. Some of them, it's just they're just hoarding and just, they're just building their empire, if you will. But then other players, we were talking about C.J. Stroud, where he has this huge house and this big contract. And he's giving it away and inviting people into his house. And going back to the question, wealth is not the issue. The question is, does wealth have you? You can have wealth, but does wealth have you? And that's why Jesus talks so much about the right perspective on wealth and money. And the example he gives in Luke 12, starting in verse 15. Then he said, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. Then he told a story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. And he said to himself, what should I do? I don't have room for all my crops. Then he says, I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and other goods. And then I'll sit back and say to myself, my friends, you have enough stored up away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for? Look at verse 21. Jesus says, yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. This parable in this text in James 5 reminds us that the problem is not with wealth and money. It's a heart issue. That's the problem. Primarily, a loving trust. A loving trust. Is your loving trust in the Lord, or is your loving trust in your bank account? And it all comes down to the attitude and your actions. If you want to find out which one that you trust more, look at your attitude and look at your actions. You see, in this parable, God wasn't mad at the farmer for having wealth. He's the one that blessed him with good crops, right? God gave this guy a great harvest. God was upset with the guy because of his attitude and actions, his greedy and self-indulgence. In other words, God gives you wealth to enjoy. God doesn't condemn wealth. God condemns putting wealth before him, making wealth the idol of trust. Jesus said in Luke 16, verse 13, no servant can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So, warning number one, wealth can make us deceived and arrogant. Warning number two, James gives, that wealth can make us cruel and greedy. And warning number three, he says, wealth can make us self-indulgent. So how do we embrace these warnings and avoid those things? You can write this down. Instead of chasing after wealth, temporary wealth, chase after eternal riches. When we chase after the things of this world, we'll miss out on being rich in the things that matter most. That's why Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to what? Receive. You see, that's God's economy. In God's trusting love, He requires trusting love. He trusts you with money to trust you to love Him with your money. To be generous to others. Paul told Timothy in his letter in 1 Timothy 6:17, teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. Look at this. By doing this, they will store up their treasure as a good foundation for the future, so that they may experience true life. If you want wealth to last, use the riches now to honor God and to use to help and bless others. Chase after eternal riches, because you can't take your wealth with you, but you can send it ahead. Does that make sense? Let me say it again. You can't take it with you, but you can now send it ahead. So be faithful in tithing, to be generous, to be willing to share, to be rich in good deeds, so that you can invest in the treasures of heaven. Yes, be a good steward of your money. If you're going to chase after something, chase after eternal riches, because it will have everlasting reward. Amen?